everyone. I hope you've been enjoying the Paddington story so far. It's my pleasure to be able to read the final part of the story to you today. So this is the last instalment for Paddington. Okay, so I'm going to finish the chapter. Paddington placed the egg in the centre of his magic table and covered it with a handkerchief. He muttered abracadabra several times and then hit the handkerchief with his wand. Mr. and Mrs. Brown looked at each other. They were both thinking of their carpet. "Hey, presto!" said Paddington, and pulled the handkerchief away. To everyone's surprise, the egg had completely disappeared. "Of course," said Mr. Curry knowledgeably. Above the applause, "It's all done by sleight of paw. But very good, though, for a bear. Very good indeed. Now, make it come back again." Feeling very pleased with himself, Paddington took his bow and then felt in the secret compartment behind the table. To his surprise, he found something much larger than an egg. In fact, it was a jar of marmalade. It was the one that had disappeared that very morning. He displayed it in his paw. The applause for this trick was even louder. "Excellent," said Mr. Curry, slapping his knee. "Making people think he was going to find an egg and it was a jar of marmalade all the time. Very good indeed." Paddington turned over a page. "And now," he announced, flushed with success, "the disappearing trick." He took a bowl of Mrs. Brown's best flowers and placed them on the dining table alongside his mystery box. He wasn't very happy about this trick as he hadn't had time to practice it, and he wasn't at all sure how the mystery box worked, or even where you put the flowers to make them disappear. He opened the door in the back of the box and then poked his head around the side. "I shan't be a minute," he said, and then disappeared from view again. The audience sat in silence. "Rather a slow trick, this one," said Mr. Curry after a while. "I hope he's all right," said Mrs. Brown. "He seems very quiet." "Well, he can't have gone far," said Mr. Curry. "Let's try knocking." He got up, knocked loudly on the box and then put his ear to it. "I can hear someone calling," he said. "It sounds like Paddington. I'll try again." He shook the box and there was an answering thump from inside. "I think he's shut himself in," said Mr. Gruber. He too knocked on the box and called out, "Are you all right, Mr. Brown?" "No," said a small and muffled voice. "It's dark and I can't read my instruction book." "Quite a good trick," said Mr. Curry. Some while later, after they had prized open Paddington's mystery box with a penknife, he helped himself to some biscuits. The disappearing bear, very unusual, but I still don't see what the flowers were for. Dear. Paddington looked at him suspiciously, but Mr. Curry was far too busy with the biscuits. "For my next trick," said Paddington, "I would like a watch." "Are you sure?" asked Mrs. Brown anxiously. "Wouldn't anything else do?" Paddington consulted his instruction book. "It says a watch," he said firmly. Mr. Brown hurriedly pulled his sleeve down over his left wrist. Unfortunately, Mr. Curry, who was in an unusually good mood after his free tea, stood up and offered his. Paddington took it gratefully and placed it on the table. "This is a jolly good trick," he said, reaching down into his box and pulling out a small hammer. He covered the watch with a handkerchief and then hit it several times. Mr. Curry's expression froze. "I hope you know what you're doing, young bear," he said. Paddington looked rather worried. Having turned over the page, he just read the ominous words, it is necessary to have a second watch for this trick. Gingerly, he lifted up a corner of the handkerchief. Several cogs and some pieces of glass rolled across the table. Mr. Curry let out a roar of wrath. Wrath means anger. I think he's very cross about his watch. I think I forgot to say abracadabra, faltered Paddington. Abracadabra, shouted Mr. Curry, beside himself with rage. Abracadabra! He held up the remains of his watch. 20 years I've had this watch, and now look at it. This will cost someone a pretty penny. Mr. Gruber took out an eyeglass and examined the watch carefully. Nonsense, he said, coming to Paddington's rescue. It's one you bought from me for £3 6 months ago. You ought to be ashamed of yourself telling lies in front of a young bear. Rubbish, spluttered Mr. Curry. He sat down heavily on Paddington's chair. Rubbish! I'll give you... His voice trailed away and a peculiar expression came over his face. I'm sitting on something, he said. Something wet and sticky. Oh dear, said Paddington. I expect it's my disappearing egg. It must have reappeared. Mr. Curry grew purple in the face. I've never been so insulted in my life, he said. Never. He turned at the door and waved an accusing finger at the company. It's the last time I shall ever come to one of your birthday parties. Henry, said Mrs. Brown, as the door closed behind Mr. Curry, you really oughtn't to laugh. Mr. Brown tried hard to keep a straight face. It's no good, he said, bursting out. I can't help it. Did you see his face when all the cogs rolled out? Said Mr. Gruber, his face wet with tears. All the same, said Mr. Brown, when the laughter had died down, I think perhaps you ought to try something a little less dangerous next time, Paddington. How about that card trick you were telling me about, Mr. Brown? Asked Mr. Gruber. The one where you tear up a card and make it come out of someone's ear? Ah, yes, that sounds a nice quiet one, said Mrs. Brown. Let's see that. You wouldn't like another disappearing trick? Asked Paddington hopefully. Quite sure, dear, said Mrs. Brown. Well, said Paddington, rummaging in his box. It's not very easy doing card tricks when you've only got paws, but I don't mind trying. He offered a pack of cards to Mr. Gruber, who solemnly took one from the middle and then memorised it before replacing the card. That means remembered what was on it. Paddington waved his wand over the pack several times and then withdrew a card. He held up the 7 of spades. Was this it? He said to Mr. Gruber. Mr. Gruber polished his glasses and stared. You know, he said, I do believe it was. I bet all the cards are the same, whispered Mr. Brown to his wife. Shh, said Mrs. Brown. I thought he did it very well. This is the difficult bit, said Paddington, tearing it up. I'm not sure about this part. He put the pieces under his handkerchief and tapped them several times with his wand. Oh, said Mr. Gruber, rubbing the side of his head. I felt something go pop in my ear just then. Something cold and hard. He felt his ear. Why, I do believe. He held up a shining round object to the audience. It's a sovereign. It's a type of coin. My birthday present for Paddington. Now, I wonder how it got in there. Oh, said Paddington as he proudly examined it. I didn't expect that. Thank you very much, Mr. Gruber. Well, said Mr. Gruber, it's only a small present, I'm afraid, Mr. Brown, but I've enjoyed the little chats we've had in the mornings. I look forward to them very much and, He cleared his throat and looked around. I'm sure we all hope you have many more birthdays. When the chorus of agreement had died down, Mr. Brown rose and looked at the clock. "And now," he said, "it's long past all our bedtimes, most of all yours, Paddington. So I suggest we all do a disappearing trick now." "I wish," said Paddington, as he stood at the door, waving everyone goodbye, "I wish my Aunt Lucy could see me now. She'd feel very pleased." "You'll have to write and tell her all about it, Paddington," said Mrs. Brown, as she took his paw. "But in the morning," she added hastily. "You've got clean sheets, remember." "Yes," said Paddington. "In the morning. I expect if I did it now, I'd get ink over the sheets or something. Things are always happening to me." "You know, Henry," said Mrs. Brown, as they watched Paddington go up the stairs to bed, looking rather sticky and more than a little sleepy, "it's nice having a bear about the house." The end. Well, I hope you've all enjoyed the story. That's the end of Paddington. I'm glad there was a nice happy ending and they enjoy having Paddington around the house. I think he'll be staying. Right, I wonder what will happen now that we've finished Paddington. Maybe there'll be a new story to listen to. I think you should all remember to check tomorrow and see if there's a new story. Goodbye for now, everyone.